the main characteristics of all these programs. And I discuss several of them at length in the book. But first of all, they're top-down dictatorial. Quotas for sterilizations, abortions, etc., are set from the top. Okay, they're dishonest. The poor, generally uneducated women are typically lied to about the consequences of operations. They're told they're reversible. They're coercive. Many people are sterilized by force, or in some cases, in Indonesia, the army actually rounding people up, etc. In India, some villages were threatened with being bombed by the Air Force unless they submitted. And in some cases, though, you are dealing with very poor people, the threat of withholding various government benefits can be extremely coercive, since they're totally dependent upon these things. They're cruel, invasive of human dignity. They're racist, as I've discussed, and they're irresponsible in that very frequently they are done with very poorly trained people doing it, people with as little as 1 day training or none at all, and they're using unsafe, unsterile equipment, sometimes contraceptive devices that are actually banned in the United States are employed in these programs. So forth. Now, one country, however, where the U.S. does not get the primary blame, because it could not be coerced in the way that these other countries could be, but nevertheless implemented one of the harshest versions of this policy, is China. This is the power of ideas at work. Okay, what happened was, 1978, a Chinese government bureaucrat named Sung Jian, pardon my pronunciation, I'm sure it's wrong, he traveled to a conference in Finland where it was a conference on control theory. Now, Club of Rome was very high on control theory. They had this whole discipline called systems analysis in which they used computers to calculate the limits of the Earth's resources and when they would run out. Anyway, they had all this stuff there, and he picked up these pamphlets, and he went back to China, and he republished them in his own name without attribution and was acclaimed a genius. And the Chinese Communist Party adopted the policy. And this is one of the hazards of having this kind of government, where if you can convince a few people, bang, there's no checks and balances in this system. Okay, and this is a horrific policy. I mean, it's just not the case that, you know, a government can say, well, you're just going to have one kid and people just have one kid. Sometimes people have more than one kid despite it. But what happens? The kids are determined illegal people. They are taken away. Okay? They're put in orphanages, and if they're not adopted, they are done away with, especially if they're girls. And this is a poster from a Chinese dissident organization called All Girls Allowed, decrying 100 million baby girls killed in China. In Africa, the irresponsible distribution of Norplant needles has caused the spread of AIDS. And this, by the way, is not according to right-wing, right-to-life people, but the UN World Health Organization, okay, has decried the population control people. The way they do population control in Africa is with a thing called Norplant that involves the use of hypodermic needles. They've given out hundreds of millions of these needles over the counter to illiterate women, and they get reused, and they spread all kinds of diseases, including notably AIDS. Okay. Another key initiative of the anti-human movement is, of course, the campaign against genetically improved foods. Now, this is really a project of the European Greens primarily, and the flagship of the European Greens is the German Green Party, which was founded by a gentleman named August Hausleiter, who had been a member of the Nazi Party since 1923. This is not a person who joined the Nazis after they became in power and you had to join them to get on. He was at the beer hall push. He was the founding chairman of the Green Party. Now, one of the Nazi fetishes, less well known, was they were totally into organic food. They were totally against fertilizers and all kinds of things of modern agriculture. And they even had organic gardens at the concentration camp so the SS could eat organic vegetables. Now, so they made this a big deal. And European Green Movement has made stopping genetically modified foods a central plank of their platforms. And the way they've been effective in this, not just in Europe but abroad, is by banning the importation of crops from third world countries that make use of genetically modified crops. And most third world countries cannot afford to give up the European market, and so they agreed to this. And as a result, the implementation of genetically modified crops has been severely hamstrung. And there's just any number of horror stories to tell about this. For instance, a lot of poor people around the world, their diets are dominated by cereals, which are vitamin deficient. And so millions of kids in the third world go blind or die from vitamin A deficiency. We've created genetically modified rice strains, for instance, called golden rice, because it's orange, got keratin in it, that would prevent this completely. But they have not been able to implement it because of a green opposition. And they've got other genetically modified crops that would eliminate other vitamin deficiency diseases or carry built-in pesticides so you don't need to spray DDT. Rachel Carson actually said, well, we'll be able to breed plants that have their own pesticides so we won't need DDT someday. Well, they've done it, but they're not allowed to do it. Fixed nitrates, which would eliminate the need for chemical fertilizer. All the things that the environmentalist movement allegedly wants, okay, can be accomplished or with these genetically modified foods, just as nuclear power can accomplish generation of electricity without all that smoke that they supposedly hated, okay? But they oppose it. Then we get to the latest craze, which is the campaign to limit our access to fuel supplies. Now, this comes in a number of ways. First of all, opposition to drilling and development. And this is extremely harmful to our economy. This graph here shows every time the price of oil has gone up, U.S. unemployment goes up a few months later. It's included especially this last time when oil went to $140 a barrel in 2008. 5 million Americans lost their jobs, couldn't pay their mortgages, mortgage-backed securities became worthless, and kaboom, here we are. One could look at what would have happened to the price of oil had we been allowed to continue growing our oil production as we had before the Environmental Protection Agency went into being in 1970. And basically, if we had, oil would be at $20 a barrel today. And finally, global warming. Now, there's a lot of dispute about whether there is global warming or not. But the thing that's really crazy about this campaign is that if there was global warming, it would be good. Okay, the human climate has changed many times in the past. We've had warm periods in the past. For instance, here in the high Middle Ages was much warmer than today. And that was a very good thing. Global warming lengthens the growing season. It also increases global rainfall. Okay, here's a global cooling period. It's called the Dark Ages. It's associated with the collapse of civilization. Okay, and the notion that, well, gee, we're afraid of global warming because if it got a little bit too warm, the climate would go unstable and we'd become like Venus is totally ridiculous. If we look at the long-term climate of the Earth was much, much warmer 60 million years ago than it is now. Compared to this change, current fluctuations are trivial, and you know, you can't have a runaway. Okay, now furthermore, putting aside the issue of warming, what about we are enriching the CO2 content of the atmosphere? Is that good or bad? Oh, that's real good, because CO2 accelerates plant growth, and there's no doubt about that. Okay, we've got photos taken from orbit since 1958, and they show that the rate of plant growth on Earth has increased by 14% since 1958. And I'm not talking about agriculture. That's done a lot better because of technology. I'm talking about wild forests and jungles and grasslands. And you can repeat the experiment in terrariums. CO2 is a limiting ingredient for agriculture. So here we are. Humans have improved the fertility of the biosphere, and we're being condemned for it. Because you see, what this ultimately is all about, this isn't about the environment at all. This is about making a case that humanity needs to be prosecuted, that humanity needs to be put in shackles. And then finally, there's the other aspect of this, which is the desire of those promoting this craze to use it as the basis for putting together a mass movement. Because if you want power, there's nothing like a mob. Okay, and so here's Al Gore. Okay, in An Inconvenient Truth, his most famous book, it says the climate crisis also offers us a chance to experience what very few generations in history have had. The privilege of knowing a generational mission, the exhilaration of a compelling moral purpose, a shared and unifying cause. Okay, The thrill of being forced by circumstances to put aside the pettiness and conflict that so often stifle the restless human need for transcendence and opportunity to rise. When we rise, we will experience an epiphany as we discover that this crisis is not really about politics. It is a moral and spiritual challenge. Okay, so it's a great way to organize a cult on a mass scale because people want to have a transcendent purpose. So here, to summarize, is the fundamental issue between the anti-human point of view and the pro-human point of view. It's ultimately about the nature of humanity. Are we destroyers or creators? In other words, are we destroyers of fixed resources that are already there? Well, if that's your worldview, then the addition of every new person on Earth is a net minus. Every nation is ultimately the enemy of every other nation. We're all competing for a share of a finite pie, and human liberty is intolerable. Humans are vermin. They're out of control. They must be put under control, and somebody's got to be in control. Okay. If you adopt the other point of view, that humans are creators, then the addition of every new human on Earth is an ultimate positive for everyone. Okay, that every nation is ultimately the friend of every other nation, and human liberty is something that is a necessity.